Hi, today I would ostensibly like to talk to you about how myself and my friend and presumably many other people would implement swing or shuffle in trackers like Impulse Tracker. But I can't really talk about one thing without talking about other related things and then kind of bringing it back to the first one again afterwards. So hopefully you won't mind too much if I make the occasional digression because, I can't really talk about how you implement swing in a tracker without talking about how digital and MIDI sequences implement keeping track of time as a series of clock ticks. So is it okay if I take the occasional digression here and there? It is? Excellent. So quantum physics, you have an atom, yeah? And within that you've got, say, your neutron, proton, electron, all that good stuff. And how the electron works is it exists kind of a certain distance from the centre in no particular place, because it's weird like that. And you might imagine that it will kind of slide or saunter from one distance to another, but it doesn't because it's weird. Instead, what it does is it remains one distance, till it feels like moving, and then it just immediately kind of jumps or hops, closer or further away. It just kind of teleports there, which is known as a quantum leap, which is why I always think it's kind of weird when people kind of boast about making a quantum leap in a certain area, because that's literally the smallest movement you can make. Anyway, as far as particle physics goes, quantum physics, I don't know anything about that, of course I don't. But I do know about sequencers such as analog sequencers and digital sequencers and MIDI sequencers, and how the latter two keep track of time is very much based on a series of discrete events. And I think it's kind of interesting here. We're talking about quantum physics with quantities, things you can count. It's not like any distance. It is either this one or this one or this one, and it's discrete countable values. And it seems like in some way they're saying that the way atoms work, or electrons in particular maybe, are kind of more like they're digital than analog. I'm sure I'm misinterpreting that, but in terms of how digital MIDI, because MIDI stands for digital, as far as those sequences go, that's very much how they work. It's just a series of discrete events with nothing in between. So before we get into all of that, first let's look at how you might use swing just as a user of a MIDI sequencer or a modern DAW without worrying too much about how it's implemented under the hood yet. So this is the venerable Creator on the Atari ST. If you use Ableton Live at all, you might recognise the series of groove settings here as the Notator series. Notator being a variant of Creator, which can read and write sheet music. 16 means we're dealing with 16th notes in particular, and A means it's straight or unswung. So let's hear that first. And now let's hear how it sounds with triplet swing, which would be 16E. And then between the two, you've got various shades of soft swing. So let's try 16C halfway between the two. Okay, so swinging a piece of music is all well and good, but what exactly is swinging? So say you've got, first of all, a straight unswung piece of music with, say, a drum beat that's got lots of 16th notes, maybe the hi-hat. That might sound something like this. As with Aphex Twin's Aegis, for example. But then if you were to swing it, it would sound more like this. As with, say, Soul II Soul's Keep On Moving. Basically the same drum beat, but the main difference, besides whether it's an 808 or 909, is swing, which only the 909 could do at the time. So, with unswung straight music, all of the notes, generally this is done with 16ths, or rather all the kind of places you could have notes are equidistant, so that they're all the same length like that. Whereas with triplet swung music, which is the most popular kind of swing, I believe, you'd have the first place you can put a note would be twice the length as the second place you can put a note. So all the odd ones are twice as long as all the even ones, like that. So it's just alternating between long note, short note, long note, short note, or rather where the notes can begin and end would be kind of like a note slot would be long, short, long, short. I don't think there's necessarily terminology for this because musicians don't think of it this way, but when you're making the sequences, you kind of start to think of it this way. Anyway, so yeah, there's basically a grid of where notes can begin and end, and those have long, short distances. So if we're thinking about digital sequencers, then we've got to see how they actually picture time, because digital sequencers are not really aware of the concept of time. Like analog sequencers, they're just getting a bunch of pulses in, and then they advance the step. So whenever they get a clock pulse, they just move on to the next step. The difference being, rather than moving on to the next step, they move on to the next clock pulse, which may or may not have a step. There's a kind of layer of abstraction there. So, the digital sequencer was invented by this guy, I think his name was Ralph Dick. He was a Canadian composer, and let's see, he made as far as I'm aware, the world's first digital sequencer, appropriately named the Digital Sequencer, and he had an in with Roland, and he showed it to them, and they liked it, and they kind of, with his blessing, took that concept and evolved it into the MC8. And well, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the MC8 was very primitive, because this was 1977 when that came out, and it was used by people like Susan Kiani and Ryuichi Sakamoto, who's basically the Mark Cerny of the electronic music world. He pops up everywhere, Ryuichi Sakamoto. If you want to pronounce in the British way, Ryuichi Sakamoto. Yeah, he just pops up in absolutely everything. It's just kind of crazy. Anyway, people like Susan Kiani and Ryuichi Sakamoto, they would program in all this music by hand on a handy little number pad like this, calculator style, putting in all the notes, including where they begin and end, in terms of counting all these clock pulses. And with the MC8 and MC4, you get to say what resolution you want this grid to be that you can put notes on. It's called the time base, rather mysteriously and tantalizingly, but it really is just what resolution the grid is that you're putting notes on. So wherever there's a clock tick, that's where you can say, I want a note to begin here or end here. And so, although you could specify your own, eventually we kind of agreed that it's actually 24 pulses per quarter note is, for most purposes, in the late 70s, early 80s, all we need. I mean, when it comes to these analog ones, it's literally 1 pulse per note. So 1 pulse, so 6 pulses per 16th, 24 per quarter. That should be enough. You know, we can do triplets and things, so that should be fine. So let's put in some 16ths here. So this is just the first quarter of a bar, just one beat. The 1 iana in the 1 iana, 2 iana, 3 iana, 4 iana. And this is just completely unswung. So if you want to swing it, then instead of counting 6 pulses for each 16th, get rid of the notes starting here, and we'll just move them on to there and there. So we're still dividing up each 8th note being 12 pulses. Instead of counting 6, 6, 6, 6, we count 8, 4, 8, 4. So now it's twice as long, half as long. So we get, because you spend 2/3 of the time on the odd notes and 1/3 on the even notes. Or if you want to be, it's that one, isn't it? Right. Or if we want to be soft swinging, where it's somewhere in between the two, then we count 7 and 5, which still goes up to 12, but it's halfway in between unswung and triplet swung. So, as far as 24 pulses per quarter note in particular goes, there's kind of an interesting story there, if you're me and find these things interesting. That was used for tape sync. So say you're using your MC8 or MC4 to record a whole bunch of parts, but it can't really output that many, or you haven't got that many synthesizers, then you'd record 1 or 2, and then you play, rewind the tape back again, and then you record some more. But you need those to be in sync with the ones you've previously recorded. So how do you get the sequencer in sync with the recording of itself? First, before recording any notes, you do something called striping the tape, where you're basically recording the clock ticks themselves. Now, those are data, they're not audio, so first they have to get converted to audio using something called frequency shift keying, which basically means whenever there's a clock pulse happening, it sends a high frequency, and whenever a clock pulse is not happening, it sends a low frequency. So it's just alternating between 2 frequencies all the time. And that is just telling it on the tape, here's where the clock pulses are happening. You run the tape, play it back, and now it can be in sync to itself. So whenever there's a clock pulse, it's just counting those, and whenever a certain number have happened, then it knows to advance onto the next step if it's got steps. Although with those ones in particular, they're not really step sequences. You can have different notes starting on different pulses, completely, independently of each other. Which is, it's a wacky way of programming it, because that thing about we want to pay attention to 5 and then miss out 7 and all of that, that is something people were entering by hand on the handy numeric keypad, like a calculator style. Aphex Twin once called it, what was it? Oh yeah, it's top, it's like entering notes on a taximeter. That's what it was like, I gather. So between 77 and when the ST came out, people started making MIDI sequences for it. It's not the most fun way of entering notes, I gather. Although it did work with an external keyboard, but if you want to edit what you've entered, or if you want to enter anything properly quantized, you have to bust out the calculator for that one. Anyway, Roland then made a mod for the MCA where instead of recording to tape, you could send the signal to another sequencer directly without converting it to audio and back again. That was called DIN-Sync, and that's what the TB303 uses, the TR606, all of those. And then, because they were one of the main companies involved in establishing MIDI, the main Japanese one, and there's only one American company, the guy actually originally came up with it. Anyway, because Roland's one of the main players for establishing MIDI, what they did is they took this DIN-Sync and were like, 24 pulses per quarter note, this is a good standard, let's carry on using that. And that's why MIDI has 24 pulses per quarter note, and that's how it stays in sync with itself on tape, as you might strap a tape, and it stays in sync with other sequences and things. And DAWs evolved from MIDI sequencers, so they too can do this. Now, the DAWs themselves actually have yet another resolution, which is the kind of internal one, which is much higher, because say even with the humble Atari ST, it has a much faster processor with higher numbers it can count to than the what was it, 8080 equivalent that was in the MC8, MC4. So what would happen there is you can play a piano solo, say, and it sounds like it's not quantized at all, like it's freestyle playing, but actually secretly it is quantized. It's just a very, very high resolution grid, so you can't really tell, it's not audible, but it is technically quantized. When you say in your DAW or your MIDI sequencer, I want to quantize this, what you're actually saying is, instead of quantizing this to 192 pulses per quarter note, quantize it to 4 pulses per quarter note, and then you get to choose whether those 4 are swung or not based on how we were doing that earlier on the whiteboard. And that's really what it is. Basically there's 3 grids that most of these sequences are looking at. The really high resolution one that seems so high that you don't notice it and it's natural sounding. Then you've got the one for synchronization purposes, where every 6 times every 16th note it's making sure it's maintaining the right speed with the outside world. And then you've got the 16ths, which may or may not be swung, which is what you can optionally make the notes conform to if you want them to be bang on timing wise for your house and techno and type genres. And so that's the 3 kind of types of grids that are inside these things. Even with DAWs, although you don't generally use them to talk to the outside world that much because they're pretty self-contained, they are the multi-track recorder, they are the MIDI sequencer and the mixing desk, they still can do this. And behind the scenes, that is how they work. So now that we know all of that, we can now go into Impulse Tracker, or rather Schism Tracker, and we can see how we might use this knowledge of ticks or pulses in order to implement swing manually. Bear in mind that instead of saying it's 24 pulses per quarter note, it's saying it's 6 pulses per 16th note, which is the exact same thing. It's just another way of saying the same thing. It's just naming it after that instead of the whole thing. But as far as that goes, they call it the speed instead of the time base, but it is the exact same thing. You say in the tracker that you want the speed of 6, that's just another way of saying I want 24 pulses per quarter note. And by changing how many we're counting, we can change how fast it's kind of progressing to the next row. And by changing it back and forth, alternating, we can implement swings. So let's try that. This is Schism Tracker, a clone of Impulse Tracker, which is what I spent most of my teenage years on in the 90s. As you can see here, the tempo is 110 BPM and the speed is 6 clock ticks per row in the tracker. So let's go to where we enter notes, and here you can see I've entered the kicks and snares and the hi-hats. Let's have a listen to those. Those are not swung yet, and if you look at the help menu, we can see that we can actually change the song speed, as in the number of ticks to count per row, by entering handy hexadecimal numbers. We're not going to be counting that high up, so don't worry. Decimal will suffice for our purposes. I'll just put down the microphone a second so I can enter them, but instead of progressing to the next row every 6 ticks and 6 and 6 and 6, we're going to do it every 8 and 4 and 8 and 4, so it lasts longer and shorter and longer and shorter. So let's try that now. Yep, this is how I used to make music back in the 90s. Let's have a listen to how that sounds. Marvellous, it's now swinging, and it's because we're changing the number of clock ticks we're counting per row, alternating back and forth. So that's how my friends and I used to do swing in trackers in the 90s. So I think we've learned quite a bit today about how digital and MIDI sequences work. Analog ones are much simpler. They get a tick or pulse and they just move on to the next step, the next value. No rest for the wicked here, it's all notes all the time. But as far as digital and MIDI sequences go, they count the clock pulses and see whether we're starting a note or finishing a note or neither. It's a bit more advanced, but clearly an evolution of the exact same technology. So thank you for watching this video, and especially to my patrons, thank you for sponsoring this video so I can make more of them. And if you like these, please do consider becoming such a patron. And either way, thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Bye bye.